My daughter-in-law slapped me in front of everyone. My son told me I deserved it. So I made sure they ended up with nothing. Have you ever stood in the middle of your own family and felt like a stranger no one wanted there? I wasn't asking for much, just a seat at the wedding of the boy I raised, the boy I gave my back to feed, the boy who once held my hand to cross the street. Now he held someone else's hand, while his wife slapped me in front of 100 guests. And he said, I had it coming. I stood there, stunned, not by the pain, but by the silence. No one stepped in. No one looked away. They just went back to dancing. They said I ruined the day, but none of them asked what had already been ruined, long before the music ever started. And the strangest part? I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just walked out and closed a door they never knew I had the key to. Subscribe if you've ever been told you were too much, when all you wanted was to be seen. In those early days, before everything turned upside down, I still believed in the quiet magic of giving. Not the kind people talk about at galas or wrap in shiny bows, but the kind that happens in silence, with no thank you expected. When my husband passed, I didn't throw myself into grief the way folks thought I would. I didn't spend my days knitting or drinking tea or waiting for the phone to ring. I stayed busy. I ran the reception hall at the old church just outside of Charleston. For 32 years, I helped plan weddings, mostly for strangers, sometimes for people I'd watched grow up. They came to me with dreams, and I gave them tables, tablecloths, peach cobblers, and a voice that could calm even the most anxious bride. I didn't have much, but I had that place. I had a rhythm. I had something to do with my hands, and a reason to keep the old Buick running. And I had Lyle, my boy. He was my one and only, my miracle after 3 miscarriages and 1 long winter of thinking I'd never be a mother at all. He grew up in that church hall. I learned to dance on the wood floor while I mopped it, slept in the back room during long receptions when I couldn't find a sitter. He used to hold my hand so tight whenever the music got too loud. By then, he was a man, nearly 40, with a clean job in insurance and a tendency to bite his lip when thinking too hard. Still that same quiet boy in many ways. Still the one who brought me roses on my birthday. Still the one who made me believe there was goodness left in the world. When he told me he met someone, I didn't get in the way. Nora, he said. Lovely girl, smart, thoughtful, reserved. Not a lot of small talk. I worked in design, modern sort. I like clean lines and quiet weekends, the kind who preferred soy candles over perfume. To be fair, she was polite the first few times we met. Not warm, not cold either, just distant, like someone always checking their internal watch. Lyle glowed around her though, and I told myself that was what mattered. A mother's job, after all, is to let go when the time comes. So I did. That winter, I made a decision. I pulled out the deed to a piece of land I'd been holding onto for years. It wasn't much. 3 acres by the river, flat and quiet, overgrown in places but with good soil and a stretch of shade trees that caught the light just right near sunset. My husband and I bought it in 1984, thinking we might build a little weekend cabin someday. But we never did. Life got busy. Then he got sick. And then it was just me. I never touched the land. I just paid the taxes and let the grass grow. I kept it under my name in a simple trust, nothing fancy. Every now and then, I'd drive by it, just to make sure it hadn't washed away. And then I'd forget about it again. Somewhere along the way, it became the one thing I still had that no one knew much about, not even Lyle. But when he said they were looking for a venue for the wedding and mentioned how expensive things were, I thought of that land. I thought of the golden hour under those trees. I thought of giving it up again. So I offered it. No strings, no speeches, just a quiet gift. He looked surprised, grateful. I'm a little confused. Then he smiled in that half-shy way he used to when he was 5 and was caught stealing a cookie. He hugged me longer than usual. That was the last time I remember feeling useful. The planning started quickly. Nora wanted modern. She wanted to be curated. She wanted a wedding that looked like something out of a catalog with neutral tones and native plants and biodegradable confetti. I didn't understand half of it, but I nodded. I kept nodding. I offered to help. With the setup. With catering. With flowers. I'd done all those things before, hundreds of times. I had files full of vendors who still took my calls. But Nora said no. Every time. She had her people. She had a vision. So I stepped back. I thought maybe that was how things worked now. Maybe mothers weren't needed the way they used to be. Maybe it was selfish to want a role in your only son's big day. Still, I had the land. My name was on the paperwork. My hands had offered it. That had to count for something. I kept checking in, casually. How were things going? What could I do? Did they need anything else? They never needed anything else. I started driving by the land again, watching it change, watching the white tents go up, watching trucks pull in and out with equipment I didn't recognize, watching strangers walk across soil I'd once dreamed of turning into a home. I stood under those trees one evening, alone, while they hung Edison bulbs overhead. The sun was low, the shadows were long, and for just a moment I could hear the music before it even started. I thought it would be beautiful. I had no idea what was coming. The night before the wedding, I brought over 2 gallons of fresh lemonade. I had sliced the lemons myself, added mint from the garden out back, poured it into old glass jugs that used to sit behind the church kitchen. Just a little something to help out. Not the main attraction, just a quiet contribution. No one took them. The jug sat by the side gate while people bustled past carrying trays and boxes. I stood there holding a dish towel and watching folding chairs appear like rows of white teeth across the grass. Someone I didn't recognize was barking orders. She had a clipboard, headset, all dressed in black like she was working security instead of weddings. I thought maybe she was part of the catering crew, or one of those day of coordinators people hire now. She never looked at me. Eventually, one of the younger girls, maybe a cousin on Nora's side, picked up a jug and asked where it should go. Before I could speak, the woman in black snapped her fingers and said outside food wasn't allowed near the main prep tent. So the lemonade stayed outside. Later that same week, I offered to help with the seating cards. I still had the old calligraphy pens from my days at the church, but Nora said they'd already hired someone to laser engrave everything, engraved names on tiny pieces of driftwood. I smiled and nodded. I hadn't expected to be center stage, but I thought maybe I'd be asked to read something, a passage, a short blessing, or maybe walk Lyle in before the ceremony. Nothing grand, just a small part. But when I asked if I should wear something formal or more casual, Nora handed me a folded slip of paper. It was an Uber voucher. She said, with a tight smile, that they had arranged transport for the non-participants so no one would get confused on the guest logistics. Non-participant. That word echoed in my chest long after she walked away. Just after the last light was strung, I walked the perimeter of the field by myself. The sun was gone, but the air still carried its warmth. I passed by the tent, heard laughter, someone uncorking champagne, someone else asking where the extra place cards were. No one called my name. I kept walking. My feet led me to the edge of the trees, where the ground dipped slightly and the sound of the river got louder. I stood there a long while. I had worn that land into memory. I knew its rhythms, the way the light changed at different hours, the feel of the dirt under my shoes, But tonight, it didn't feel like mine. It felt like I had given it away. The next morning, I dressed early. I wore a slate blue dress with pearl buttons down the front. Simple but elegant. I brushed my hair back into a low twist and pinned on the brooch my husband had given me our last Christmas together. I packed a light sweater in case the wind picked up and made my way to the driveway, waiting for the car. It pulled up late. Not a limousine, not a shuttle, just a mid-sized car, windows down, the driver chewing gum and scrolling his phone. He asked for my name, tapped something on his screen, and started driving before I closed the door all the way. At the field, I stepped out and saw rows of white chairs filled with people I didn't recognize. Most of them from Nora's side, I assumed. They looked polished, cool tones, the kind of people who say good morning without stopping their steps. I looked for Lyle. Didn't see him. Someone ushered me toward the back row, third from the end, besides an elderly couple I didn't know. The woman gave me a tight smile. The man was already dozing in his seat. A few hours before the music began, I watched as the bridal party took photos under the archway of twisted willow branches. Nora's dress was modern, sleeveless, with a low back and a sheer veil that floated behind her like fog. Lyle stood beside her, hands folded in front of him. He looked handsome, nervous, focused. He did not look in my direction. Someone passed out programs. I unfolded mine slowly. My name wasn't printed anywhere. Mother of the groom, blank. The space was simply left out, like I had never existed. That quiet Friday evening, the music began. The minister took his place. The crowd hushed. The sun slipped behind the ridge, and everything turned gold. As Nora began her walk down the aisle, I felt someone tap my shoulder. It was the woman in black, clipboard still in hand. She leaned in and whispered, flatly, that there was a slight issue with seating and asked if I could vacate my chair for a photographer who needed the angle. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. I stood. I stepped to the side. I watched from behind a tree, and no one turned around, not even Lyle. When the last guest left, I was still standing near the tree line. The grass beneath me had grown cold. I hadn't moved since the ceremony ended. My legs ached, but I didn't notice. I was watching the fairy lights twinkle against the evening sky like stars pretending to belong to this world. Someone dropped a champagne glass. The sound cracked through the air like a warning shot. Laughter followed. Then a voice over the speaker asked everyone to move toward the tent for dinner service. No one came looking for me. Later that evening, I wandered toward the catering tables. I hadn't eaten all day. My stomach had gone past hunger into something tighter and quieter. I spotted a familiar face near the back. Greta. She had worked with me for years, used to bake pies for our old church receptions. Her hair was tied back, flowers still clinging to the edges of her sleeves. She caught my eye and gave a small wave, but before she could walk over, a man in a vest with a headset stepped between us. He pointed toward the other side of the field and said guests were not permitted near staff prep zones. Greta hesitated, but I shook my head. I didn't want her to get in trouble. I turned away and made my way back to the edge of the clearing. As the music faded, I caught sight of Lyle. He was slow dancing with Nora under the tent. The crowd had thinned. People were clapping in rhythm. A few kids were chasing each other between tables. Lyle looked happy. He was smiling in that soft, absent way he used to when lost in thought. He still hadn't seen me. I thought maybe it was time to leave. I had already missed dinner, the cake, and the toast. I didn't want to stand there any longer pretending not to notice what had been taken from me. Back home in the quiet, I kicked off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the light. The house was still. No music. No chairs being moved. No laughter. just the soft creak of the floor settling under its own age. I had expected to feel angry. I didn't. I felt small. I reached for the phone. I scrolled through photos out of habit. None from the wedding. I hadn't taken a single picture. I hadn't been in any. The realization settled in like a slow frost. I had attended my only son's wedding and left no trace. In the silence that followed, I noticed the envelope. It was on the kitchen counter, tucked behind the fruit bowl. My name scrawled across it in Nora's handwriting. I opened it slowly. Inside was a thank you card, printed, cold. At the bottom, she had written one short line. "Thank you for letting us use the space. We've decided to move forward with other arrangements long term." That was it. No mention of the years I had worked in that field. No word about the hundreds of couples I'd helped. No acknowledgement of the land's history or meaning, just that they'd be moving forward. The next day, I drove out to the land early. The tents were still up. Trash bags lined the path near the trees. Stray streamers drifted like ghosts along the fence line. The generator was humming low, forgotten and running on fumes. I walked the perimeter again, this time slower. Every step felt like a goodbye I hadn't agreed to. By the far edge, near the old tree with the split trunk, I noticed something new. A wooden post, freshly planted, with a small laminated sign stapled to it. Event space, future site of the Willow Grove venue. Below that, an email address and a name, Lyle Reynolds, Executive Coordinator. I read the sign twice, then a third time. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I just stood there. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a takeover. Without a conversation, without consent, without so much as a knock on my door. They had taken the land I had offered for one day and turned it into a plan, a business, a future, one I wasn't a part of, one I hadn't been told about. Later that afternoon, I pulled the deed from the drawer in my bedroom. It was still there, still in my name, still filed in the trust I had created after my husband passed. I checked the registration number, the plot lines. Everything was unchanged. But in that moment, I knew something else had changed entirely. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was erasure. Not loud, not messy, but complete. And I had watched it happen with my own eyes. My shock wasn't loud. It was a quiet, cold settling in my bones. Erasure, I now understood, wasn't about being forgotten. It was about being replaced while you were still standing there. And as I lay awake that night, the silence of the house no longer felt like peace. It felt like a countdown. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt louder somehow. Pipes breathing, floorboards shifting, the kind of noise you only notice when you're lying still with too much truth in your chest. I kept expecting the phone to ring. I thought maybe Lyle would call. Maybe he would say it was all a mistake. Maybe he hadn't seen me in the crowd. Maybe someone had moved the place card. Maybe he didn't know about the sign posted at the edge of the field. But the phone didn't ring. The first person I spoke to was the woman at the county clerk's office. Her name was Diana. She wore thick glasses and had a kind voice. I asked if there had been any updates or inquiries filed under my trust or property ID. She pulled it up on her screen, squinted, then shook her head. Nothing had changed. No transfers, no liens, no claims, which meant legally, everything was still mine. But something didn't sit right. I asked if someone could use the land without my permission. She said no, unless I had signed something. I hadn't. Not a single paper. 2 days later, I showed up at the assessor's building. I brought my copy of the deed, along with the folder from my trust documents. The man behind the desk looked over the papers, nodded politely, and said the records were in order. Then he said something else, something that caught in my throat. He said I wasn't the first one to come in about that property this month. I paused. He didn't give names, but he mentioned a young couple had asked about zoning and permits. They had been inquiring about commercial use, outdoor events, possible water hookups, portable bathroom access, the kind of things people look into when planning to use land for profit. My land. He handed me a pamphlet, Guidelines for Landowners Applying for Conditional Use Permits. I folded it and slid it into my purse without saying a word. By the end of the week, I called my old neighbor Millie. She had been away visiting her daughter upstate and missed the wedding. I hadn't told her what happened yet. I thought maybe saying it out loud would make it feel more real. Millie listened quietly. Then she cleared her throat and said she'd heard something similar happen to her cousin a few years back. Land being used under the table, families cutting each other out, quiet paperwork, friendly facades. She told me not to confront anyone yet. Just gather everything. Just stay calm. I hung up and sat on the porch until the sky went dark. That Thursday, I found myself in the town library again. I hadn't been there in years. The building still smelled like old paper and lemon wax. I walked past the fiction shelves and straight to the back where the local newspaper archives were kept. I pulled out the last 3 months' worth of community columns, and there it was, a feature story about a new event space opening on private land outside the city line. It mentioned a soft launch, described the aesthetic as rustic chic, gave credit to the young couple spearheading the project, Lyle and Nora Reynolds. There was a photo too, the same willow arch, the Edison lights, the field I had mowed every spring until my knees gave out. I traced the caption with my thumb. Below it were comments from local vendors, praise for the couple's vision, notes about sustainability, how lucky the community was to have young professionals bringing fresh ideas. No mention of me, no history, no legacy, no note about where that land came from or who had kept it all those years. I closed the paper slowly. I folded it once, then again, slid it into my bag. When I got home, I opened the closet in the hallway, pulled down a box labeled Documents. I hadn't touched it in years. Inside were records, letters, notes from my husband, tax receipts, and, at the very bottom, the original land purchase agreement. My name, his name, the day we signed it, June 14th, 1984. I sat there on the hallway floor, papers scattered around me, one hand on the deed, the other on my lap. Still no call from Lyle, no message, no visit, no apology. Just the sound of the old clock ticking above the mantel, reminding me what time does best. It moves on without asking who it leaves behind. One morning, I walked the boundary of the land with a notepad. The sky was low and gray, not yet raining, but heavy with the thought of it. I wore my old gardening boots, the ones with the split near the heel. Every step felt familiar, but everything else had changed. I started from the old fence post, the one Harold and I had hammered in our first year on the property. From there, I moved clockwise. I noted the line where the grass dipped toward the creek, the path where we used to set folding chairs for the annual harvest dinner, the slope of the field that caught the golden light in late afternoon. I marked everything, not because I had forgotten, but because I needed it in front of me, on paper, in ink, as if writing it down could protect it. It began with small things. I went through every drawer in the house, pulled out contracts, receipts, property tax records, sorted them by year, anything that had our names, anything with signatures, anything I might need later. I used to do this sort of thing casually, filing on Sundays, a chore between soup and laundry. Now it felt like building armor. The more I gathered, the steadier I felt. It was the first time I had looked through our legal files since Harold passed. His handwriting greeted me like a whisper. Notes in the margins, doodles along the edge, a smiley face next to a payment confirmation. He had been so careful, every decimal aligned, every folder labeled. There was a letter too, folded inside our original property agreement. It wasn't legal, just personal. A note he had written the day we bought the land. For us, for the future, for the work that matters. I tucked it in my sweater pocket and kept going. The next few days were quiet but sharp. I stayed inside for the most part, kept the windows open, let the breeze remind me I was still here. I baked a peach cobbler, chopped wood for the stove, cleaned the guest room even though no one was coming. I did the sorts of things that made a house feel like a home again. I also listened. The caterers came by to collect their equipment. I watched from behind the curtain. They didn't knock, just pulled up the trucks and started loading crates. I made a note of the time, the license plate, the name on the van. Later, I walked out and found a pile of printed programs left behind. Dozens of them, unused, each one with Nora and Lyle's names in bold script. I flipped through them, page after page, quotes about love, partnership, legacy. But none of those words had been written for me. By the end of that week, I knew I needed help. I didn't call Lyle. I didn't speak to Nora. I didn't send any messages or write any letters. Instead, I called someone who knew what this sort of thing looked like when it got ugly. Her name was Ellen Briggs. She had been our family lawyer years ago. She helped Harold set up the trust. She was sharp, quiet, the kind of woman who let silence stretch until the other side made a mistake. We hadn't spoken since Harold's funeral, but when I explained what was happening, she didn't sound surprised. She asked me for copies of everything: deeds, emails, photos, newspaper clippings, anything that showed intention. She told me to gather them, scan them, and label each file by date. Then she said something else. Do not speak about this to anyone until I say so. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. That afternoon, I made a new folder on my desk, labeled it plainly, no fancy names, just 4 words: land, trust, use, evidence. I placed it beside my tea, opened the first drawer, and began. The wind picked up outside. Leaves spun along the porch rail. The land was changing seasons, but I was changing too. Not loudly, not angrily, but fully. What started as quiet preparation became action. I didn't wake up feeling brave that day. It wasn't about courage. It was about clarity, the kind that settles in after a storm. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that sharpens. Like cold air on skin, it wakes you, not gently, but fully. I brewed coffee but let it sit. The cup stayed full as I worked through the files. Ellen had sent over a document, a draft of a cease and desist letter. It was crisp, clean, precise. Not one word was wasted. At the top, it named me. At the bottom, it warned of further legal steps should unauthorized commercial use continue. I read it twice before printing. Then I opened a second document. This one was longer, an official filing for preliminary injunction. Ellen had added a sticky note at the end. Only use this if they push back. But be ready. I didn't hesitate. I printed that too. I took my time reading every clause in that document. Every sentence had weight. I traced each paragraph with a pen, underlining terms like exclusive ownership, violation of trust, material harm. These weren't just words. They were shields. Proof that silence wasn't weakness. It was a strategy. I mailed the first certified letter with shaking hands. The man at the post office didn't ask questions. He placed the envelope on the scale, stamped the corner, and handed me a receipt. I folded it once and placed it in my wallet. The mailbox clicked shut, and something in me clicked too. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't bitter. It was a reclamation of land, of dignity, of history. I had tended that land longer than my son had known how to ride a bike. It held our memories, our sweat, our grief. It wasn't decoration. It was a legacy. The next morning, I walked into the county clerk's office with a folder. Inside were dated photos, event permits from years past, my late husband's signature on every seasonal renewal, a handwritten list of every group that had used the land over the decades. I had saved them all. Scouts, churches, veterans, even a local theater troupe once rehearsed a summer play there. The woman behind the counter glanced through it and nodded. I left her a copy. That same day, I met with Ellen face to face. Her office was smaller than I remembered, lined with books stacked sideways, a photo of her dog by the lamp. She listened as I laid out the timeline: wedding, exclusion, public usage, unauthorized plans. She took notes without interrupting. When I was done, she leaned back and asked one question. "Did they ever get your permission in writing?" I shook my head. She smiled without softness. "Then we have the leverage." I spent the rest of that afternoon filing paperwork, public notice of ownership rights, notification to vendors, a statement clarifying my non-involvement with the business proposed under the name Willow Grove Venue. Ellen explained that with this paper trail, any third-party contract signed without my consent could be voided. I didn't need to knock on their door. I didn't need to yell. All I needed was to speak the language they couldn't ignore. Paper, proof, procedure. Later that week, I returned to the field. The chairs were gone. The lights were taken down. Just the trampled grass remained. I stood at the center, arms crossed, letting the wind press against my back. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was still, the way the land had always taught me to be. At home, I filed every document in order, dated, labeled, stored in a fireproof box, not because I expected flames, but because I had stopped expecting kindness. That evening, I sat by the window and watched the sun draw lines across the floor. The same golden hue that once lit up wedding arches now touched my hands. I had no garlands, no guests, no applause, just truth. And it was more than enough. The following weekend brought more guests. The cars arrived around noon. I watched from the upstairs hallway window. Out of sight, but not out of range. They parked in the same neat rows along the side path, close to the east field. Same white signs, same twinkling lights already dangling in the trees. Same people walking confidently across my grass. They moved across my land like they owned it. A man in suspenders carried a speaker. 2 women rolled in tables dressed in cream linen. Someone in a wide hat lit citronella candles and placed them along the gravel walk. Every movement rehearsed. Every face relaxed. That Saturday afternoon felt like a rerun. I stood behind the curtain, silent, steady, eyes tracking everything. The music started before sunset. Low jazz at first, then something brighter. Laughter rose and fell like waves. There was no hesitation, no pause, no whisper of consequence. They truly believed I was done. I noticed more lights strung between trees, new ones, brighter bulbs, the kind used for styled events, where pictures matter more than memories. A photographer moved through the guests, snapping candids. Someone popped a bottle of sparkling wine and sprayed it into the air. Nora's voice carried through the trees like nothing had happened. She greeted the caterer like an old friend. She wore a blush dress, fitted and smooth, like it had been tailored for her new role. She floated from group to group, hand on shoulders, sharing plans for a full season of bookings. I listened from inside, hands resting on the window frame. She used words like partnership, expansion, collaboration. Not once did she say inheritance. Not once did she say mother-in-law. And Lyle, my son, he stood near the arbor, holding a clipboard, checking things off as the band set up. He nodded to vendors, pointed to cables, made calls with the kind of energy I used to see when he coached high school baseball. They were building something, not just an event, but an identity, public, branded, polished, as if they had conjured it out of thin air, as if the land had no story before they arrived. The sound of laughter spilled through the open windows. I turned from the glass, walked to the kitchen, opened a folder on the counter. Inside were printed screenshots, social media posts, comments, mentions, a photo tagged with the words Willow Grove Collective. In the background, I spotted the old oak bench Harold carved in 1992, our initials still faintly etched on the side. They had started an account, promoting the space, booking for fall weddings, taking deposits. I circled the date on the flyer, September 18th. Then I circled another name, the name of a florist reposting the venue's page. Each post, each tag, each image added to the file. Ellen had told me, the more they document it as theirs, the easier it is to prove intentional misrepresentation. So I let them post. I let them talk. I let them shine. The more they celebrated, the clearer their pattern became. Later that night, I sat outside with a flashlight and my notes. I traced each guest name I could remember, matched vendors from previous years, compared layouts from old harvest festivals to the new arrangements Nora had drawn up and posted as inspiration. They weren't just using the land. They were repurposing its legacy and erasing its source. It wasn't theft in the traditional sense. It was something softer, slicker, but more dangerous. It was a rewriting of history, one elegant table at a time. But history has its witnesses, and I was one. I closed the notebook, tied a string around the folder, tucked it under my arm, and went back inside. In the mirror, I saw my own reflection. Not older, not tired, sharp, ready. They toasted under fairy lights. I boiled water for tea. They played music. I made a list of everything that would be submitted in the next filing. They wore smiles. I wore silence, but not the kind they thought. This time, silence was a strategy, and it would not last forever. Ellen called just after breakfast. Her voice was calm, but she got to the point quickly. The documents had been filed. The court had reviewed the case. The injunction was approved. That afternoon, the court issued the injunction. Not a threat, not a request, a legal freeze. It blocked all ongoing operations under the name Willow Grove Collective. No events, no business transactions, no contracts signed using my property. I didn't celebrate when the notice arrived. There was no champagne, no joy, just a strange stillness, like the sound of the house after guests leave. Not empty, just quieter, truer. That morning, I wore my church coat and went downtown. I held the envelope against my chest on the bus. The courtroom wasn't large. A single flag in the corner, pale walls, a carpet that hummed underfoot. I sat in the second row, not at the front. I didn't need to be seen. I just needed to be present. The clerk called the case. Lyle and Nora weren't there, only their representative. A man in a pressed blue suit with a stack of folders he had barely skimmed. He argued that there was no intent to harm, that the events were organized in good faith, that family matters often blur lines. But the judge didn't blink. He looked at the records, the photos, the letter I had mailed weeks ago. He asked one question: who owns the land? Ellen answered. She handed over the deed, the trust agreement, Harold's signature, my name. There was no debate after that. The order was finalized. Immediate injunction. Further use of the property without written consent would be considered a violation, subject to damages. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The paper he signed said everything. The court date was set for mid-September. That would determine long-term terms. Ownership never was in question, but future rights, compensation, and reputation, that would take more. Still, the freeze was in place. That was enough for now. The venue website was updated then taken down. I checked that evening. The homepage, once filled with smiling couples and sunset photos, now showed an error message. Their social media pages disappeared one by one. Even the hashtag they had created stopped getting traction. Vendors started reaching out. Some asked for clarification. One florist apologized for tagging the wrong name. A photographer sent over photos from the last event and said he would no longer be using the location. I saved everything. Ellen told me the silence that followed would be loudest for them. And she was right. I spent the next few days moving with intention. I rewalked the fields. I measured the eastern boundary again. I marked each post with orange ribbon, just like Harold used to before the harvest. I opened the barn and aired it out, not for events, not for anyone else, just for myself. Neighbors noticed. One left a pie on my porch. No note, just warm peaches and cinnamon wrapped in a towel. Another waved longer than usual when passing by. The town didn't speak openly, but they saw. They always had. That Sunday, I opened the window and let the breeze carry through the kitchen. I played the radio low. I made soup. Nothing loud, nothing grand, but everything is steady. The paper now sat in a frame above the fireplace, not to gloat, but to remember. Those words could matter. That proof could hold. That justice, even slow, could arrive. And when it did, it didn't need to shout. It just needed to be signed. The call came on a Wednesday evening. I had just finished folding laundry when the phone rang. It was the old landline in the hallway, the one Harold installed back when the house still echoed with children's feet and weekend dinners. I hadn't heard it ring in weeks. Most people used cell phones now, but I kept it plugged in, maybe out of habit, maybe out of memory. I picked it up without looking at the caller ID. There was a pause, then his voice. It was Lyle. He didn't say hello the way he used to. His voice had a new stiffness, not cold, just cautious, like someone inching across thin ice. He started by saying he was surprised, said he hadn't expected things to go this far, that he wished I had spoken to him directly before involving lawyers, that this was family and families should work things out without courts. I let him speak. I didn't interrupt. Not because I agreed, but because I had learned that silence often carries more weight than rebuttal. When he finally paused, I answered with one sentence. You made your choices, Lyle. He went quiet for a moment. Then came the pivot. He said Nora was emotional, that the slap was a mistake, that she had felt cornered and misunderstood, that the business had been meant to honor our land, not steal it, that he didn't think I would mind. I closed my eyes and took a breath. For years, I had mothered this boy, fed him, sewed his school costumes, held him after nightmares. I had forgiven more than he knew. But this conversation wasn't about parenting anymore. It wasn't even about the land. It was about truth. I told him I didn't care what Nora felt. I told him that honoring something doesn't involve erasing the one who built it. I reminded him that silence doesn't mean permission, that being family doesn't mean being free from consequence. He didn't argue. He only asked what I wanted. That's when I knew. He hadn't called to apologize. He had called to negotiate. I stood straighter. I said I didn't want anything from him. Not a check. Not a favor. Not even an apology. I said the court would handle the legal matters, and I would handle the rest by living my life without pretending this never happened. He said he missed me. I said he missed the version of me that tolerated being overlooked. That version no longer existed. He asked if we could meet, have dinner, talk in person. I told him I needed space, not time. Space. He asked if this was permanent. I didn't answer. Some truths don't require response. They settle in the silence. We ended the call without a goodbye. I stood in the hallway holding the phone for a long time after he hung up. The cord is still warm in my hand. I thought about the weight of years, about the difference between forgiveness and forgetting, about how some bridges aren't burned, they're simply no longer walking. That night, I walked the porch with a blanket draped over my shoulders. The stars were bright, the trees still. My breath clouded slightly in the cool air. The quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. Inside, I opened a journal and wrote one sentence. I choose peace, not denial. It was almost dusk when the knock came. Soft at first, then a pause, then another. I was in the back room sorting through old family photographs, separating the ones I would keep from the ones I would tuck away. The knock pulled me back into the present. I didn't hurry to the door. I finished labeling the last envelope before I stood up. The light outside had begun to fade, painting the porch in a bluish shadow. I recognized the outline through the window. It was Lyle. He stood with his shoulders slightly slumped, wearing the same gray jacket he used to wear when he'd visit with groceries and stay for dinner. There was no bag in his hand this time, no smile either. Just him, standing still. I didn't open the door right away. Instead, I leaned my forehead lightly against the wall beside the frame. I listened. No more knocks. Just silence and the creak of the wood beneath his feet. He waited. I finally opened it halfway. He looked older, not by years, but by something heavier, like the weight of consequences had finally landed. His eyes met mine. He didn't speak first. I asked him why he was here. My voice didn't rise. It didn't falter. It just floated, like steam from a teacup. He said he wanted to talk. He used words like mistake and regret, said he had time to think, that he missed the house, that he had dreams about Dad walking through the fields. I didn't answer right away. I watched his hands, the way they curled and flexed like he didn't know what to do with them anymore. He said Nora had moved out. The things between them had changed, that the business was officially closed, that he didn't know who he was without all of it. I told him I hoped he'd find out. He asked if we could start over. I told him the land would never be used for business again. He nodded. Then he asked if we could sit, talk inside, just like before. I looked at the living room behind me. The couch was clean. A lamp glowed near the bookshelf. There was warmth in the room, but not for this. I told him I wasn't ready to sit with him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He blinked but didn't protest. There was no dramatic reaction, no raised voice, just a long silence that said more than anything he could have said. He stepped back. He said he understood. I closed the door gently. Then I walked back to the room with the photos. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was clarity. There are people who think time heals all things, but some wounds don't need healing. They need recognition. They need distance. They need boundaries that aren't up for discussion. Later that night, I sat on the porch. The air was crisp, and the crickets had just begun their song. I wrapped the same blanket around my shoulders I had used all winter, the same one I had worn the night the court order came in. I thought of all the times I had left the door open, not just literally, but in every way that mattered. I had waited. I hope so. I doubted myself for feeling betrayed. Not anymore. I had set the locks, not out of spite, but out of love for my own peace. And this time, the porch light stayed off. I walked the edge of the pasture that morning. The grass was still damp, and the scent of cedar carried in the wind. The old boundary markers I had repainted weeks ago stood sharp and clear, orange tape fluttering just slightly. The land felt steady again, like it had exhaled after holding its breath too long. The court documents arrived in a thick envelope, not dramatic, no sheriff, just a delivery left neatly in the mailbox, like a final line drawn. The ruling was official now. Lyle and Nora were barred from using the property in any form. They owed damages, fees, legal restitution for the business income they had falsely claimed under my land. The number wasn't small. Their accounts were frozen for weeks. Their LLC was dissolved. And because they had used the house as collateral in their expansion plan, the bank moved faster than expected. The venue space was no longer a business. It was just a liability. The venue signage was pulled down overnight. No ceremony, no final post. Just an empty wooden board with holes where nails used to be. Neighbors started asking quiet questions again. At the post office, in church, a few at the grocery store. Nobody pressed too hard, but they asked where Lyle and Nora had gone, why their house was suddenly empty, why no weddings were booked for spring. I didn't offer answers. I didn't owe any. But the truth always finds its way in small towns. I stood by the oak tree as workers carried out the last chairs. The metal ones Nora had bought in bulk. The ones she had insisted gave the place a rustic feel. One of the movers asked where I wanted them stacked. I said he could take them, sell them, burn them. It didn't matter anymore. The last item out of the barn was a fake flower arch. I almost laughed. So much effort spent on appearances. I stayed on the porch as they loaded the last truck. When the dust settled, the field was bare. No banners, no music, no guests. Just the land and its silence. I went inside and poured myself a cup of coffee. I sipped it slowly. No rush. No need to go anywhere. For the first time in years, my time was mine again. Later that week, a notice ran in the local paper. A public statement from the court summarizing the case. I didn't read it aloud. I didn't need to. But I clipped it and slid it into a folder with all the others. Not out of spite, but for memory, for evidence that silence, when paired with truth, can carry farther than shouting ever will. I had dinner alone that night, cooked myself something simple, roasted vegetables, a piece of fish. I set the table with one plate, one glass, no performance, just nourishment. There was peace in the quiet. They lost the house. They lost the venue. They lost the reputation they had built on borrowed charm. But I still had my name, my land, my roots. I still had my mornings, my porch, the way the sunrise touched the fence line in soft gold. I still had my stories, my boundaries, my right to say no and mean it. No one clapped for me. No one threw a party. But I celebrated anyway, not loud. Just real. I lit a candle and watched the flame flicker in the center of the table. A small, steady light. Nothing more, nothing less. Sometimes, that's all reclamation looks like. I didn't expect the silence afterward to feel so wide. Not empty, not lonely, just wide. Like something had stretched open inside me and left space for air to move. I kept the porch swept. Kept the mailbox clear. I started planting again. Not because I had to. Because I could. The town moved on, as it always does. Lyle never came back. At least not to stay. I heard he found work 2 counties over. Something quiet. Something temporary. Nora's name stopped appearing on local contracts. Her social media accounts went dark. The house they had taken over was listed for sale. The photos still showed the lavender walls she had painted, the barn lights she had hung too low. No one bought it for months. Sometimes I'd pass it on the way to the market. I never slowed down. The land remained mine, not just legally, but in spirit. I brought out old journals and started reading again. Not the legal ones, the handwritten ones, the ones where I had once written grocery lists alongside dreams. I found notes from years ago. Lines like, "Remember to prune the eastern fence line and check on the Wells Creek." It reminded me who I had been before all the noise, before I became someone who needed to defend herself just to breathe in her own home. I took long walks at sunset. I watched the deer come back to the edge of the trees, heard birds I hadn't heard in years. They had waited too, I think. Waited for the noise to die down, for the ground to stop shaking. I had a few neighbors over in spring. Nothing big, just coffee, lemon bars, laughter. It was the first time I let people sit on the porch again. No business talk, no explanations, just presence. The story people knew was only the surface. But I didn't need everyone to know the rest. Because I knew what it meant to stand up with quiet conviction. I knew the difference between forgiveness and foolishness. I knew the cost of peace. I also knew that I didn't win. This wasn't a victory. It was a refusal to be erased, a refusal to let someone else rewrite the history of the land, of my marriage, of my motherhood. They tried to replace me in the very place I had built from the roots up. But I didn't let them. Now I don't need a plaque or a newspaper column or a town hall handshake. I have my home. I have my name. And I have this moment. That's enough. Some wounds don't bleed. They whisper. They echo. They make you doubt what you gave, what you carried, what you meant to those you raised. I used to think dignity was something others had to see in me, that if no one acknowledged it, it must have vanished. But I learned, slowly, that dignity is quieter than that. It lives in what you don't allow, in what you walk away from, in what you reclaim without shouting. They didn't steal everything. They just tried. And I let them, for a while. But silence is not the same as surrender. What I learned is this. You can lose a house. You can lose time. You can even lose the people you once loved more than yourself. But if you keep your name, if you keep your boundary, if you stand up one morning and say no more, then you haven't lost everything. You've just begun again. If you've ever been overlooked in your own story, pushed aside in your own home, I hope this made space for you. Subscribe if you believe your voice still matters, even when others try to erase it. Here, we don't scream. We don't beg. We reclaim.